Fewer than 1 in 20 overnight retail workers in the United States ever receive a written list of survival-style instructions beyond standard procedure. Yet scattered internal reports suggest that unusual incident logs spike by as much as 17% between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. in isolated fuel stations. This is the life story of a doctrine born not from imagination, but from patterns of risk, of human behavior, and of quiet attempts to impose control on ours when oversight fades. It began with a problem that did not look like a problem at first. Gas stations had always been liminal spaces, edges of cities and highways, places that stayed awake when everything else slept. The modern 24-hour station expanded rapidly in the late 20th century, driven by logistics chains, trucking demands, and urban sprawl. Yet the doctrine of overnight safety lagged behind. Most procedures assumed normal customers, predictable threats, and visible authority. What they did not account for was isolation, one worker, one building, and long stretches of time where anything unusual had no immediate witness. A lesser-known fact is that early corporate safety manuals from the 1980s often allocated less than the pages to overnight operations, compared to over 20 pages for daytime theft prevention. The parents of the instruction list were not dramatic. They were insurance companies, corporate liability departments, and regional managers responding to incident reports that did not fit neat categories: strange customer behavior, unexplained equipment failures, repeated minor disturbances that never escalated enough to become police cases but were too consistent to ignore. Over time, these fragments formed a pattern not of a single threat, but of unpredictability itself. A lesser-known fact is that internal insurance audits in the early 2000s found that nearly 42% of overnight incidents were logged as ambiguous, meaning they could not be clearly classified as crime, accident, or a human error. Early versions of the list were simple: lock doors after a certain hour, do not allow loitering, keep lights fully operational. But small additions began to appear. Instructions that seemed oddly specific: do not respond to knocking at the side door, do not leave the counter unattended, even for a minute. If a customer repeats a question more than 3 times, end the interaction. Each addition came from an incident that had been difficult to explain but easy to repeat in prevention. A lesser-known fact is that one regional chain reported a 9% drop in overnight disturbances after introducing a rule-limiting conversation. Linked with customers after 2 a.m. childhood of the doctrine was awkward and uneven. Workers often ignored the list. It felt excessive, even paranoid. Training rarely emphasized it beyond a quick mention during onboarding. Many employees treated it as optional, something written by someone who had never worked a night shift. Early failures were common. Incidents continued, sometimes in patterns that matched the ignored rules. A lesser-known fact is that employee compliance surveys from one major retailer showed that fewer than 30% of overnight workers could recall more than half of their safety instructions after 1 week on the job. Small changes began to matter more than large policies. Placement of mirrors behind counters reduced blind spots. Timed locks prevented accidental door access during vulnerable hours. Cameras improved, but more importantly, their positioning changed based on worker feedback rather than corporate design. The doctrine was slowly learning from those who lived it. A lesser-known fact is that repositioning a single convex mirror in one pilot program reduced reported unseen presence complaints by 22%, despite no change in actual incident rates. There were misunderstandings too. Some workers believed the list implied hidden dangers beyond crime, something intangible. Others dismissed it entirely as corporate overreach. The truth was simpler and more complex at the same time. The list was not about a single threat. It was about reducing variables in an environment where variables multiplied after midnight. A lesser-known fact is that cognitive studies of night shift workers show a measurable decline in threat assessment accuracy after 3 a.m. with error. Rates increasing by up to 18%. Growth came quietly. As more stations adopted standardized overnight procedures, the list became formalized. It was printed, laminated, sometimes posted near registers. Corporate manuals expanded. Training modules included simulations. Logistics adapted deliveries were rescheduled. Staffing overlaps were introduced during peak vulnerability hours, and emergency protocols were tightened. A lesser-known fact is that shifting fuel delivery times away from 2 o'clock to 4 a.m. windows reduced combined safety incidents by approximately 11% across several regional chains. The system around the doctrine matured. It was no longer just a list. It became part of a network, cameras, alarms, communication systems, and reporting structures. Workers were encouraged to log unusual behavior, even if it seemed insignificant. Over time, these logs became data, and the data refined the doctrine further. A lesser-known fact is that aggregated overnight incident logs revealed that nearly 60% of repeat disturbances occurred within a 15-minute window on consecutive nights, suggesting patterned human behavior rather than random events. Standardization brought its own challenges. Not all locations were the same. Rural stations faced different risks than urban ones. Weather, terrain, and local culture influenced behavior. The doctrine had to remain flexible while maintaining consistency. A lesser-known fact is that stations located near highways reported 25% higher rates of transient-related incidents, while inner-city locations reported higher rates of short-duration disturbances. Then came its peak, the moment when the doctrine proved its value. It was not a single event, but a convergence of many. A well-lit station, a trained worker, a clear set of rules followed without hesitation. A situation that could have escalated did not. A pattern recognized early was interrupted. The list worked not because it predicted the future, but because it limited exposure to it. A lesser-known fact is that compliance with full overnight safety protocols correlates with up to a 35% reduction in incident escalation, according to internal safety audits.in. Defining scenarios, the doctrine showed its strength. A customer behaving erratically is kept at distance. A door remains locked despite pressure to open it. A call is made early instead of late. These are small actions, but together they form a barrier. Not absolute, but effective. A lesser known fact is that early reporting of suspicious behavior increases successful intervention rates by law enforcement by nearly 28%. Compared to delayed calls, why did it work there in those moments? Because it removed hesitation. The list replaced uncertainty with instruction. It gave workers something to follow when instinct might fail under fatigue or fear. It simplified decision-making in complex situations. A lesser-known fact is that decision fatigue among night shift workers can reduce reaction speed by up to 20%, making predefined rules significantly more effective than improvised responses. But the cost was real. The doctrine demanded constant vigilance. Workers had to remain alert for hours with little stimulation. Fatigue set in. Isolation weighed heavily. The psychological effect of anticipating danger, even if rare, accumulated over time. A lesser-known fact is that long-term overnight workers report higher rates of mild anxiety symptoms, with some studies indicating a 15% increase compared to daytime staff. Fear was not always rational, but it was present. Every unusual sound, every delayed response, every repeated question could trigger caution. The line between awareness and stress was thin. A lesser-known fact is that elevated cortisol levels have been recorded in night shift workers during low activity periods, suggesting stress without visible cause. Injuries were rare but telling. Slips during rushed movements, mistakes made under pressure. The doctrine reduced major incidents but could not eliminate human error. A Lesser known fact is that minor workplace injuries during overnight shifts are 12% more likely to involve distraction or fatigue compared to daytime incidents. Survival, in this context, was statistical. Most nights were uneventful. Most workers never faced a serious danger. But the doctrine existed for the exceptions, not the norm. A lesser known fact is that fewer than 5% of overnight shifts involve any form of recorded disturbance. Yet these account for a disproportionate share of safety policy development. Old age came gradually. Technology began to replace parts of the doctrine. Automated locks, AI-assisted surveillance, remote monitoring centers. Fewer workers were left alone. Systems took over tasks once managed by human judgment. A lesser-known fact is that stations using AI-assisted camera systems report up to a 40% faster detection time for unusual activity compared to manual monitoring. New tactics emerged. Contactless payments, reduced interaction, self-service kiosks, minimized exposure. The role of the overnight worker began to change from active manager to passive overseer. A lesser-known fact is that contactless transaction systems reduced average customer interaction time by nearly 50%, lowering opportunities for conflict. The doctrine did not disappear, but it evolved. Some rules became obsolete, others remained unchanged. A few were expanded, adapted to new forms of risk. A lesser-known fact is that legacy safety rules from early manuals still appear, almost unchanged, in modern training documents, particularly those related to restricted access and visibility. In the end, its legacy is quiet. It does not belong to headlines or history books. It lives in routines, in habits, in decisions made without thought. Later systems copied its logic, reduced variables, defined responses, trust patterns over instinct. A lesser-known fact is that modern retail safety frameworks across multiple industries trace their structure to early overnight protocols developed for isolated service environments. What militaries might call doctrine, this was in miniature, a set of learned responses shaped by repetition and refinement. It taught that not all threats need to be understood to be managed. A lesser-known fact is that risk mitigation models in civilian sectors increasingly mirror military-style decision trees, emphasizing predefined responses over situational improvisation. And it leaves behind a simple truth. Control is never complete, especially in the quiet hours. But structure, even imperfect, can hold the line long enough for morning to arrive. By the time the list had settled into routine use, its language had already begun to change in subtle ways. Early versions were written like instructions. Later ones read more like constraints on behavior, narrowing what a worker was allowed to do rather than expanding it. This shift reflected a deeper understanding that risk at night was not just about what happened, but about what workers chose to engage with. A lesser-known fact is that internal revisions of overnight manuals show a 23% increase in prohibitive language. Do not, never avoid over a 10-year period, indicating a move toward restriction-based doctrine. There were additions that seemed minor but carried weight. Rules about eye contact, instructions on when to acknowledge a customer and when to ignore them, guidelines on tone of voice after certain hours. These were not about politeness, they were about control of interaction. Every second of engagement increased unpredictability. A lesser-known fact is that behavioral training studies found that limiting verbal engagement with agitated individuals reduces escalation probability by approximately 31% in retail environments. The list also began to absorb lessons from outside its original environment. Practices from security services, late-night transportation systems, and even hospital night shifts were studied and adapted. The doctrine was no longer isolated. It was learning from other systems that operated under similar conditions of fatigue and reduced oversight. A lesser-known fact is that cross-industry safety workshops in the early 2010s led to the adoption of standardized escalation thresholds. reducing inconsistent responses between locations by nearly 18%. In some locations, the list grew longer than intended. What started as a page became several. Workers pushed back. Too many rules created confusion, and confusion undermined the very purpose of the doctrine. This forced a refinement: fewer rules, but clearer ones. A lesser-known fact is that pilot programs that reduced instruction lists by 40% while improving clarity saw a 12% increase in compliance rates among overnight staff. Training adapted alongside it. Instead of memorization, emphasis shifted to pattern recognition. Workers were taught not just what to do, but why the rules existed. This created a different kind of compliance, one based on understanding rather than obligation. A lesser-known fact is that retention of safety procedures improves by up to 25%. When workers are taught underlying reasoning instead of rote instructions, they were still failures. Incidents where the list was followed, yet outcomes were not ideal. Situations that fell outside the patterns the doctrine was built to manage. These moments exposed its limits. No system could anticipate everything. A lesser-known fact is that post-incident reviews show that approximately 14% of overnight incidents involve scenarios not covered by existing protocols. Requiring ad hoc decision-making, improvisation became a quiet companion to the doctrine. Workers developed their own small habits, adjusting lighting slightly, keeping certain items within reach, positioning themselves in ways that maximize visibility. These were not written, but they spread through informal training and shared. XPERIENCEA, lesser known. Fact is that informal peer-to-peer training accounts for nearly 35% of practical safety knowledge. Transfer in retail environments. Technology continued to reshape the environment. That environment, cameras became smarter, not just recording, but interpreting. Alerts could be triggered by movement patterns, loitering duration, or unusual behavior. This reduced reliance on constant human observation, but it also introduced new dependencies. A lesser-known fact is that false positive alerts from early AI surveillance systems occurred in up to 27% of cases, leading to alert fatigue among workers. With these systems came new rules. Trust the alert, but verify. Do not ignore repeated signals. Do not assume the system is always correct. The doctrine expanded to include not just human behavior, but machine behavior as well. A lesser-known fact is that human operators override automated alerts in approximately 22% of cases, highlighting ongoing tension between automation and judgment. The peak of the doctrine was not a moment in time, but a state of balance. Human awareness, supported by structured rules, reinforced by technology, each component compensating for the weaknesses of the others. A lesser-known fact is that hybrid systems combining human monitoring with automated detection reduce missed incidents by nearly 33% compared to either method alone. Yet even at its most refined, the costs remained. Workers described a different kind of fatigue, not physical, but cognitive. The constant need to assess, to decide whether something was normal or not, created a low-level strain that accumulated over hours. A lesser-known fact is that cognitive load measurements show sustained attention tasks during night shifts can reduce working memory capacity by up to 15% over a 6-hour period. There were psychological effects that were harder to measure, a sense of unease that lingered even after shifts ended, difficulty separating routine caution from unnecessary fear. For some, the doctrine followed them home. A lesser-known fact is that studies on night shift workers indicate a 10 to 12% increase in sleep disturbances linked to heightened situational awareness during working hours. Social isolation added another layer. Overnight workers operated on different schedules, often disconnected from typical support systems. The doctrine assumed independence, but independence came with its own risks. A Lesser known fact is that employee turnover rates for overnight retail positions are approximately 1.4 times higher than for daytime roles, partly due to social and psychological factors. As newer technologies matured, some aspects of the doctrine began to fade. Remote monitoring centers could oversee multiple locations at once. Panic systems became more reliable. The need for extensive instruction lists diminished in some areas. A lesser known fact is that centralized monitoring can reduce on-site decision-making requirements by up to 45%, shifting responsibility away from individual workers, but removal created gaps. Workers who relied too heavily on systems sometimes reacted slower when systems failed. The doctrine had to reassert the importance of human judgment, even in a highly automated environment. A lesser-known fact is that response times increase by an average of 8 seconds when operators rely primarily on automated alerts rather than direct observation. Adaptation continued. The list became modular, different rules for different environments, adjustable based on location, risk level, and available technology. This flexibility allowed it to remain relevant even as conditions changed. A lesser-known fact is that modular safety systems improve adaptability scores by nearly 20% in multi-location operations compared to fixed protocols in its later years. The doctrine influenced areas beyond gas stations, convenience stores, small hotels, late-night pharmacies, adopted variations of the same principles. The idea spread quietly, carried by necessity rather than recognition. A lesser-known fact is that over 70% of 24-hour retail formats now incorporate some form of structured overnight safety protocol, derived from early service station models. Its legacy is not dramatic. It does not claim to eliminate risk. It does not promise safety. What it offers is reduction of uncertainty, of exposure, of hesitation. It turns unknowns into manageable variables, even if only partially. A lesser-known fact is that risk reduction strategies in operational design are considered successful if they lower incident probability by as little as 5%, underscoring the incremental nature of safety improvements. And in the quiet hours, when the world narrows to a single building and a single person, that reduction is often enough. The lights stay on, the doors remain controlled, the shift continues. A lesser-known fact is that over 90% of overnight retail shifts conclude without any recorded anomaly, a reminder that the doctrine's greatest success is often invisible. Not memory in the human sense, but accumulation layers of revision that carry traces of earlier incidents, preserved because removing them felt riskier than keeping them. A lesser-known fact is that policy retention studies show that, beyond their original documented justification, there were debates within the organizations that maintained it. How much of the list was necessary, and how much was inertia? Safety departments argued for caution. Workers themselves often existed between those pressures, expected to follow rules that sometimes seemed disconnected from their daily reality. A lesser-known fact is that internal policy audits frequently identify redundancy rates of 15 to 20% in mature procedural systems. Removing sometimes it shifted the burden back onto the worker, forcing them to interpret situations without guidance. Provided structure. A lesser-known fact is that decision support frameworks reduce error rates by up to 19% compared to environments where individuals must rely solely on personal judgment under stress. There were also, in colder climates, rules emphasized visibility during snow and reduced mobility. In hotter regions, hydration and fatigue management became central concerns, largely due to reduced visibility and altered human behavior. In some places, the list became almost ritualistic. It functioned as both instruction and reassurance. A lesser-known fact is that per-shift ritual behaviors are associated with a 9% improvement in task consistency, particularly in isolated work environments. But rituals can also obscure meaning. Words that once carried urgency become background noise. The doctrine had to be periodically refreshed, not rewritten entirely, but re-emphasized in ways that restored its intent. A. Improved procedural recall by nearly 22%. Compared to annual-only training models, there were moments when the system was tested in ways it had not anticipated. In these cases, the doctrine did not collapse, but it showed strain. A lesser-known fact is that multivariable incident scenarios account for, but contribute disproportionately to post-incident policy changes. Improvisation under pressure revealed both strengths and weaknesses. Workers who understood the principles behind the rules adapted more effectively than those who relied on memorization alone. This reinforced a shift already underway from strict instruction to guided reasoning. A lesser-known fact is that scenario-based training improves adaptive, in addition, had by now become central. Remote assistance could be activated instantly. Audio links connected workers to monitoring centers. Lesser-known fact is that two-way communication systems reduce perceived isolation among overnight workers by approximately 18%. But the doctrine had to account for absence as well as presence of support. They are associated with significantly higher stress responses among staff. In its late maturity, the list became less about specific actions and more about thresholds. These thresholds were clearer, more defined, and more consistently applied. A lesser-known fact is that clearly defined escalation thresholds. Long-term exposure to controlled risk environments created subtle behavioral changes. For some, this was beneficial. Behaviors outside the workplace in approximately 8% of individuals, fatigue remained a constant companion, and support, the biological limits of night work, could not be fully mitigated. The doctrine adapted around this. That rarely entered reports, situations avoided, risks reduced before they materialized. These were the true measure of the doctrine, though they left little trace. A lesser-known fact is that preventative actions, by definition, of workers entered the system, the list became part of their baseline understanding. The doctrine had become normalized. A lesser-known fact is that normalization of safety protocols can increase initial compliance rates among new employees by nearly 13% compared to earlier cohorts. Eventually, its identity as a list began to dissolve. It became integrated into digital systems, training modules, automated prompts. Workers no longer always saw it as a single document, but as a series of embedded cues throughout their environment. A lesser-known fact is that integrated digital guidance systems improve real-time compliance by up to 21% compared to static, printed instructions. And still, its core remained recognizable. Limit exposure, control interaction, reduce uncertainty. These principles persisted even as the form changed. A lesser-known fact is that core risk reduction principles tend to remain stable across decades, with over 75% of foundational guidelines unchanged in long-term safety systems in its final stage. It existed in design, in training, in behavior. It no longer needed to announce itself to be effective. A lesser-known fact is that embedded safety design features, built into the environment rather than instructed, can reduce reliance on active decision-making by up to 30%. What it leaves behind is not a story of danger, but of adaptation. It learned to operate within it. A lesser-known fact is that operational doctrines are considered mature when their primary function shifts, marking a transition from response-based to prevention-based systems. And in that quiet shift from reacting to shaping conditions, the life of the list finds its end, not with disappearance, but with absorption into the systems that replaced it, leaving behind a framework that continues to guide without being seen.